The wind carved through my bones like a surgeon's blade as I guided my sled dogs deeper into Alaska's white hell, carrying letters that might be the last words between the living and the dead. 23 years I'd been running mail through these frozen arteries of civilization, and I'd learned that winter doesn't just kill, it tortures first, slowly stealing your warmth, your hope, your sanity until you're nothing but meat wrapped in wool. The temperature had dropped to 40 below, and my breath crystallized before it could escape my lungs, each exhale a small death in the endless white. My lead dog, Thor, whimpered as ice crystals formed on his snout, but we both knew stopping meant dying. The letters in my satchel felt heavier than gold, carrying news of births, deaths, and broken hearts to the scattered souls foolish enough to call this wasteland home. Alaska had taught me that survival wasn't about strength, was about the willingness to keep moving when every fiber of your being screamed to surrender. This particular delivery would test that lesson in ways I couldn't yet imagine, and by the time I understood the true weight of what I carried, it would already be too late to turn back. The trail ahead disappeared into a curtain of swirling snow, but I knew these paths like scars on my own skin, every bend, every hidden ravine, every place where the ice grew thin enough to swallow a man whole. My dogs struggled against the harness, their paws finding purchase on the packed snow that had been beaten down by countless sleds before mine, each journey leaving invisible marks of those who'd gambled their lives against the wilderness. The silence was absolute, except for the rhythmic panting of my team and the whisper of runners cutting through powder, a sound that had become the soundtrack to my solitary existence. Inside my coat, pressed against my chest, were 14 letters, bound with twine messages from the outside world to the miners, trappers, and dreamers who'd chosen exile over comfort. One letter felt different from the rest, heavier somehow, and when I'd loaded it at the Fairbanks post office, the postmaster had looked at me with eyes that held secrets. His words echoed in my memory. "Thomas, some deliveries change a man's soul." I'd laughed then, thinking myself immune to whatever drama played out in other people's correspondence. But the wind seemed to whisper warnings I was too stubborn to heed. The landscape stretched before me like God's own graveyard, unmarked white crosses as far as the eye could see, each drift and mound potentially hiding the remains of someone who'd underestimated winter's appetite. My thermometer read -42 degrees, cold enough to freeze spit before it hit the ground, cold enough to turn exposed skin black in minutes, cold enough to make your teeth ache with every breath. Thor's ears were pinned back against the wind, but his steady gait never faltered. That dog had saved my life more times than I cared to count, reading dangers in the ice that my human eyes couldn't detect. The other dogs followed his lead, Kodiak with his scarred muzzle from a wolf encounter, Luna, whose white coat made her nearly invisible against the snow, and Bear, the youngest, whose enthusiasm hadn't yet been beaten down by Alaska's cruelty. Together we formed a small pack of survivors, bound by mutual dependence and the shared understanding that out here, loyalty wasn't just virtue, it was survival. We'd been running for 6 hours, and my destination, the remote mining settlement of Coldwater Creek, still lay another day's journey through terrain that had claimed better men than me. But I'd made a promise to deliver these letters, and in Alaska, a broken promise was often the difference between hope and despair for those waiting in the endless white dot. My fingers had long since gone numb inside my fur-lined gloves, and I flexed them regularly to prevent frostbite from claiming the tools of my trade without my hands. I couldn't handle the dogs, couldn't set up shelter, couldn't perform the 100 small tasks that kept death at bay in the wilderness. The sled bounced over hidden rocks and fallen branches, each impact sending jolts through my spine that reminded me I wasn't as young as I used to be, that every winter took something from me that spring never quite gave back. My water bottle had frozen solid an hour ago, but I'd learned to carry it against my body heat, melting small sips with my own warmth throughout the day. The sun hung low and pale in the southern sky, providing no heat but just enough light to distinguish the trail from the deadly drop-offs that flanked our route. In my years carrying mail through Alaska's interior, I'd seen things that would break a weaker man's mind: frozen corpses sitting upright in chairs, entire families who'd simply gone to sleep and never woken up, cabins where spring revealed tragedies that winter had kept perfectly preserved. The territory had a way of collecting secrets in its snowdrifts, and sometimes those secrets found their way into the letters I carried, transforming simple mail delivery into something far more dangerous. Today felt different, though heavy with anticipation, as if the very air knew that this journey would demand a price I wasn't prepared to pay. The storm was building behind me, dark clouds pregnant with the kind of snow that could bury a man alive. But I pushed forward because stopping meant freezing to death in my tracks. My boots crunched through the crusted surface with each step as I guided the sled around a particularly treacherous bend where the trail narrowed to barely wider than the sled itself. The wind picked up, sending ice crystals stinging against my face like tiny needles, and I pulled my scarf higher to protect what little exposed skin remained. Thor suddenly stopped, his hackles rising as he stared ahead at something I couldn't yet see, his low growl barely audible over the wind but unmistakably warning of danger. In Alaska, you learn to trust your dog's instincts above your own. They could smell death, sense unstable ice, detect the presence of predators long before human senses registered any threat. I squinted through the swirling snow, trying to make out what had spooked my lead dog, when the wind shifted and cleared the air for just a moment. There, perhaps 50 yards ahead where the trail curved around a stand of frost-covered spruce trees, I glimpsed something that made my blood freeze colder than the Arctic air around me. What I saw defied explanation and challenged everything I thought I knew about survival in the Alaskan wilderness. But it would be several more minutes before I understood that this discovery would haunt me for the rest of my days. She stood there, like a vision carved from ice itself, a young woman in a pristine white wedding dress that seemed to glow against the gray backdrop of the storm, her dark hair flowing loose around her shoulders as if no wind dared disturb her ethereal presence. My heart hammered against my ribs as I stared at this impossible sight. No human being could survive more than minutes in this cold, wearing nothing but silk and lace. Yet there she was, motionless as a statue, facing away from me toward the deeper wilderness. Thor wind and pawed at the snow, his instinct screaming that something was fundamentally wrong with this picture. But I found myself dismounting the sled despite every survival lesson I'd ever learned. The rational part of my mind insisted this had to be a hallucination brought on by cold and exhaustion. But my eyes refused to look away from the delicate figure who seemed to be waiting for something or someone. Her dress was immaculate, untouched by the grime of travel or the harsh realities of frontier life, as if she'd been plucked from a church altar and deposited in this frozen wasteland by some cruel god's twisted sense of humor. I called out to her, my voice cracking in the bitter air, but she didn't move, didn't acknowledge my presence in any way. The silence that followed my call was deeper than death itself, broken only by the labored breathing of my dogs and the distant howl of wind through the trees, and I knew with growing dread that whatever I was about to discover would change everything I thought I understood about this godforsaken territory. As I approached her cautiously, each step crunching through the snow like breaking bones, I noticed details that made my skin crawl beneath my heavy coat. Her feet were bare, pale as marble, yet showed no signs of frostbite despite standing in snow that should have claimed her toes within minutes. The wedding dress was clearly expensive, made of fine silk with intricate lacework that spoke of wealth and civilization, completely out of place in this wilderness where most women wore practical wool and fur just to survive another day. Her breathing was so shallow it was almost imperceptible, tiny puffs of vapor barely visible in the frigid air, as if she existed in some state between life and death. I could see no tracks in the snow around her, no evidence of how she'd arrived at this exact spot, on a trail that saw perhaps one traveler per month during the worst of winter. The storm clouds overhead seemed to part slightly, allowing a shaft of pale sunlight to illuminate her figure, and that's when I noticed her lips were moving in what appeared to be silent prayer or perhaps conversation with invisible companions. My dogs remained at the sled, refusing to come closer despite my commands, their primitive instincts warning them away from whatever supernatural force had brought this bride to the middle of nowhere. I reached out to touch her shoulder, my gloved hand trembling not from cold but from a fear I couldn't name. And when my fingers made contact with her dress, I felt a shock that had nothing to do with static electricity and everything to do with the realization that this woman was very much alive, very much real, and very much in mortal danger. "Miss, you need to come with me right now," I said, my voice barely above a whisper as I fought to maintain the calm authority that had kept me alive through 2 decades of wilderness. "Mail delivery." She turned slowly, as if moving through thick honey, and when her eyes met mine, I saw depths of sorrow that seemed older than the mountains themselves. Grief so profound it made my own hardships feel like minor inconveniences. Her face was beautiful in the way that broken things sometimes are, delicate features marred by exhaustion, lips blue from cold, skin so pale it was almost translucent, yet her eyes burned with an inner fire that spoke of determination and secrets too heavy for one person to carry. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound emerged at first, just small puffs of vapor that dissipated quickly in the brutal air, and I found myself leaning closer to catch whatever words she might offer. When she finally found her voice, it was barely audible over the wind, a whisper that carried the weight of desperation. "Have you seen him? My husband. He promised to meet me here." The words hit me like a physical blow because no sane man would arrange to meet his bride in the middle of the Alaskan wilderness, miles from the nearest settlement, during the worst winter storm in recent memory. I glanced around at the endless expanse of white, searching for any sign of another human presence, but found only the vast emptiness that had already claimed so many souls foolish enough to challenge nature's supremacy. Something was terribly wrong with this entire situation, but standing here debating the impossibility of her story would only ensure that we both became permanent residents of this frozen cemetery. Without waiting for further explanation, I swept her up into my arms, surprised by how light she felt, as if the cold had already begun the process of transforming her from flesh and blood into something more ethereal. Her skin was ice-cold through the thin fabric of her dress, and I could feel her body trembling violently as the full impact of the temperature finally seemed to register in her consciousness. "We need to get you warm immediately," I said, carrying her back toward my sled while my mind raced through the logistics of keeping another person alive in conditions that were already pushing my own survival skills to their limits. She didn't resist, but I felt her eyes scanning the horizon behind us, still searching for the husband who had either abandoned her to die or had already become another victim of Alaska's merciless appetite. My dogs watched our approach with obvious unease, their ears flat against their heads, but they didn't bolt as I'd feared they might. I wrapped her in my heaviest fur blanket, the one I'd been saving for emergency shelter, and settled her onto the sled behind me where she'd be, somewhat protected from the worst of the wind. Her teeth chattered so violently I could hear them over the storm, and when I looked into her eyes again, I saw something that chilled me more than the Arctic air. The look of someone who had accepted death but hadn't yet figured out how to die. The next few hours would determine whether I could save this mysterious bride or whether I'd simply delayed the inevitable while ensuring my own destruction in the process. As I secured the blankets around her and prepared to resume our desperate race against the storm, she grabbed my wrist with surprising strength, her fingers like ice even through my thick gloves. "He said he'd wait for me by the old mining camp," she whispered, her voice gaining urgency as hypothermia began to loosen her grip on consciousness. "Thomas Whitmore, he said we'd start our new life together once the preacher married us, but when I got there was nothing but empty buildings and silence." The name hit me like a sledgehammer to the chest because I knew Thomas Whitmore had delivered letters to him for 3 years at the Coldwater Creek mining operation. Knew him as a quiet man who kept to himself and never mentioned having a bride waiting anywhere. Her story was either the ravings of a mind broken by cold and abandonment, or evidence of a deception so cruel it defied human comprehension. But either way, she was my responsibility now. I climbed back onto the sled and called to my dogs, who seemed eager to put distance between themselves and this strange passenger we'd acquired. The storm was intensifying, and I estimated we had perhaps 2 hours of daylight left before full darkness made travel impossible. But turning back wasn't an option. We were already too far from any shelter except the mining camp she'd mentioned, the same camp where her phantom groom had supposedly been waiting. As the sled began moving again, cutting through snow that seemed to grow deeper with each mile, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being drawn into something far more dangerous than a simple rescue mission. The bride behind me had stopped shivering, which in my experience was either a very good sign or a very bad one, and I suspected I was about to learn which. The bride's breathing had become dangerously shallow as we pressed deeper into the wilderness, and desperation drove me to make a decision that violated every principle of my profession. I needed to know who she was, and the answers might be hidden in the mail satchel pressed against my chest. With one hand guiding the sled and the other fumbling through my coat, I located the leather pouch containing the 14 letters bound for Coldwater Creek, my fingers searching for anything addressed to Thomas Whitmore or bearing a woman's handwriting. The ethical weight of what I was about to do pressed down on me heavier than the Arctic wind. But watching this mysterious bride slowly succumb to hypothermia, while carrying potentially life-saving information, felt like a betrayal of something more sacred than postal regulations. My hands shook as I found 3 letters bearing Whitmore's name, the paper crackling like dry leaves in the brutal cold, and I knew that once I broke those seals, there would be no returning to the simple world where I was just a mailman delivering other people's secrets. The storm raged around us with increasing fury, as if nature itself was warning me against this violation of trust. But the woman behind me was fading fast, and desperate times had always demanded desperate measures in this unforgiving land. I glanced back at her pale face, noting how her lips had turned from blue to an alarming shade of gray, and made my choice with the grim determination of a man who'd learned that survival sometimes required sacrificing principles. The first letter I opened would change everything I thought I knew about the mining camp ahead, and the man who had supposedly left his bride to die in the snow. The first envelope tore open with a sound like breaking bones, and I tilted the letter toward what little light filtered through the storm clouds, my eyes scanning the delicate script that spoke of love, hope, and dreams that seemed impossibly naive for the harsh realities of frontier Alaska. "My dearest Thomas," it began, "I can hardly contain my excitement as I write these words, knowing that by the time you read this, I will be only days away from becoming your wife. The train journey from Boston has been difficult, but my love for you sustains me through every mile, every uncomfortable night in strange hotels, every moment of doubt about leaving everything I've ever known." The handwriting was educated, refined, clearly belonging to a woman of means who had abandoned comfort for love or what she believed was love. I read on, my heart sinking with each line as the letter revealed details of her journey, her financial sacrifices, even the specific date she expected to arrive at the mining camp, all information that a devoted groom should have possessed. The letter was dated 3 weeks ago, which meant she'd been traveling toward this desolate wilderness while winter tightened its deadly grip on the territory, following directions that should have led her safely into the arms of her beloved. Instead, she'd found abandonment and near death, which suggested that either Thomas Whitmore was the cruelest man alive, or something far more sinister was unfolding in these frozen wastes. I stuffed the letter inside my coat and reached for the second envelope, knowing that each revelation would only deepen the mystery, while the woman who'd written these hopeful words slowly died behind me. The second letter bore a different postmark, sent from Coldwater Creek itself just 2 weeks prior, and when I opened it I discovered handwriting I recognized from 3 years of mail deliveries. Thomas Whitmore's rough, utilitarian script that spoke of a man more comfortable with pickaxes than poetry. Eleanor, the letter began, and I realized I finally had a name for the dying bride. I received your last letter with great joy, and I want you to know that everything has been prepared for your arrival, including the small cabin I've been building for us behind the main camp buildings. The words seemed normal enough, even romantic in their simple way, but as I continued reading, details began to emerge that made my blood run colder than the Arctic air surrounding us. Whitmore wrote of specific arrangements he'd made: a wedding, a ceremony performed by Father McKenna from Nome, a celebration with his fellow miners, even a honeymoon trip to Fairbanks once the spring thaw made travel easier. These weren't the words of a man planning to abandon his bride to die in the wilderness. They were the genuine expressions of someone preparing for the most important day of his life. Yet Eleanor had arrived at an empty camp, found nothing but silence and abandonment instead of the warm welcome and loving husband she'd been promised. The contradiction between this letter and reality created a puzzle that my tired mind struggled to solve. But one thing was becoming terrifyingly clear: someone had been lying to Eleanor, and that deception had nearly cost her life. I reached for the third letter with growing dread, suspecting that it would reveal truths too horrible to contemplate. The final envelope felt heavier than the others, as if it contained more than mere paper and ink, and when I tore it open with numb fingers, several items fell into my lap, along with the folded letter, a small photograph, what appeared to be a crude map drawn on brown paper, and a key tied with string. The photograph showed a young woman with delicate features and intelligent eyes, unmistakably the same person now wrapped in furs behind me. But the image had been defaced with what looked like deliberate scratches across her face. The letter that accompanied these items was written in a third hand, neither Eleanor's elegant script nor Whitmore's rough scroll, but something altogether more menacing that sent ice water through my veins even before I began to read the actual words. Thomas, your bride is more valuable than you realize, and her arrival presents opportunities that extend far beyond whatever romantic notions you might harbor about marriage and happiness. The letter began, each word chosen with the precision of someone accustomed to manipulation and threat. The writer went on to detail Eleanor's background, her wealthy Boston family, her substantial inheritance that would become accessible upon marriage, even the specific amount of money she'd brought west to start her new life. This wasn't a love letter or even friendly correspondence. It was the cold calculation of someone who viewed Eleanor not as a person but as a commodity to be exploited. The map appeared to show locations around Coldwater Creek, marked with symbols I didn't recognize, while the key remained a mystery that filled me with foreboding. As I folded the letter and secured the items inside my coat, I realized that Eleanor's disappearance might not have been abandonment at all, but something far more sinister than that. By rescuing her, I might have inserted myself into the middle of a deadly game I didn't understand. The implications of what I'd discovered crashed over me like an avalanche, and I found myself pushing the dogs harder despite the deteriorating conditions, driven by the urgent need to reach Coldwater Creek and find answers that might keep us both alive. Eleanor had stirred behind me, her voice barely audible as she mumbled something about the man with the scar and promises made in darkness, fragments of memory or delirium that added new pieces to an increasingly terrifying puzzle. The storm was reaching blizzard intensity, and visibility had dropped to mere yards, forcing me to rely on Thor's instincts to keep us on the trail that led toward what might be safety or might be a trap. My mind raced through the possibilities. Someone intercepted Eleanor's correspondence with Whitmore, replacing his genuine letters with forgeries designed to lure her into the wilderness. Was Whitmore himself part of whatever conspiracy had targeted this vulnerable young woman, or was he another victim of circumstances beyond his control? The weight of the stolen letters felt like burning coals against my chest, evidence of crimes I didn't yet fully understand but could no longer ignore. I'd spent 23 years carrying other people's mail without reading so much as a return address unless absolutely necessary, but necessity had a way of redefining itself when survival was at stake. The wind howled around us with supernatural fury, as if the very elements were conspiring to prevent us from reaching our destination. But I pressed forward with the grim determination of a man who'd stumbled into something far more dangerous than weather. Eleanor's fate and perhaps my own now depended on reaching Coldwater Creek and discovering what had really happened to Thomas Whitmore, assuming he was still alive to provide answers. The mining camp materialized through the blizzard like a graveyard of broken dreams. Its dark buildings hunched against the storm like wounded animals seeking shelter from a predator they couldn't escape. What should have been a bustling operation with smoke rising from multiple chimneys and the warm glow of lanterns and windows was instead a collection of silent structures that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, creating an atmosphere of abandonment that made my skin crawl beneath my heavy coat. My dogs began to whine and pull back against their harnesses as we approached the main gate. their primitive instincts detecting dangers that my human senses couldn't yet identify. But I forced them forward because Eleanor's breathing had become so shallow I feared she might slip away before I could get her to proper shelter. The snow around the camp was unmarked by recent footprints, no paths worn between buildings, no evidence of the daily activities that should have characterized a working mine, yet I could feel eyes watching us from the darkened windows. Thor suddenly stopped and began to growl, his hackles rising as he stared at something beyond my vision, and when I followed his gaze, I noticed that one building, a large cabin near the center of the camp, showed a faint glow seeping through gaps in poorly fitted shutters. The silence was absolute, except for the wind and Eleanor's labored breathing. But that silence felt pregnant with menace, as if the very air was holding its breath in anticipation of violence. I had delivered mail to dozens of mining camps over the years, and they all had their own distinct sounds and rhythms. But Coldwater Creek felt dead in a way that suggested something terrible had happened here, something that might explain mysterious abandonment and the sinister letters I'd discovered. As I climbed down from the sled to investigate, every instinct screamed at me to turn around and flee. But the dying woman in my care and the questions burning in my mind drove me forward into what I suspected might be a trap. Eleanor stirred as I lifted her from the sled, her eyes opening briefly to focus on the dark buildings surrounding us. And for a moment I saw recognition flicker across her pale features before being replaced by confusion and fear. "This isn't right," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the storm. The letters described warm lights and welcoming faces. "Not this tomb." Her words confirmed my growing suspicions that someone had deliberately misled her about conditions at the camp. But before I could question her further, she lapsed back into semi-consciousness, her body going limp in my arms with the terrifying stillness of someone teetering on the edge of death. I carried her toward the building with a faint light, my boots crunching through snow that seemed deeper and more treacherous with each step, as if the very ground was trying to trap us in this desolate place. The door to the cabin was slightly ajar, hanging on hinges that creaked ominously in the wind. And when I pushed it open with my shoulder, I was greeted by a wave of stale air that carried the unmistakable scent of fear, unwashed bodies, and something else I couldn't immediately identify but that made my stomach clench with dread. Inside, a single oil lamp cast dancing shadows on rough wooden walls, and I could make out shapes that might have been furniture covered with dusty cloths, but the light was too dim to reveal details. I called out a greeting, my voice echoing strangely in the confined space, but received no response except the continued howling of the wind and the settling creaks of old timber. As I stepped across the threshold with Eleanor in my arms, I noticed dark stains on the floorboards that could have been spilled coffee or tobacco juice. But my experience with violence in the frontier told me they were probably something far more sinister. The cabin felt like a stage set for a play that had ended badly, with all the actors having fled or been removed before the final curtain, leaving only props and shadows to suggest the drama that had unfolded here. I laid Eleanor on what appeared to be a makeshift bed near the lamp, quickly checking her pulse and finding it weak but steady. Then turned my attention to building a fire in the stone hearth that dominated one wall of the cabin. The kindling was dry and caught quickly, soon providing both light and warmth that began to chase away the oppressive atmosphere of abandonment and decay that had greeted our arrival. As the flames grew stronger, they illuminated details I hadn't noticed in the dim lamplight: scratch marks on the walls that looked like they'd been made by fingernails, overturned chairs that suggested a struggle, and most disturbing of all, ropes lying in neat coils on a table as if someone had been preparing for activities that required restraining unwilling participants. The fire's warmth began to revive Eleanor, and she opened her eyes fully for the first time since I'd found her, taking in our surroundings with an alertness that suggested her earlier confusion might have been more protective shock than actual delirium. "Where are we?" she asked, struggling to sit up despite her weakened condition. And when I told her we were at Coldwater Creek, her face went white with terror that had nothing to do with cold or exhaustion. "No," she whispered, shaking her head violently. "This can't be the place Thomas described. This can't be where he wanted us to build our life together." Her reaction confirmed that the letters she'd received had painted a picture completely at odds with the grim reality of this abandoned camp. But before I could comfort her with platitudes about misunderstandings and simple explanations, a sound from outside made us both freeze in terror. Heavy footsteps were approaching through the snow, multiple sets by the sound of it, and whoever was making them wasn't concerned about stealth or surprise. Eleanor grabbed my arm with surprising strength, her eyes wide with the kind of fear that comes from recognizing mortal danger. And in that moment I realized we weren't alone at Coldwater Creek. After all, we'd simply walked into the spider's web, and now the predators were coming to examine their catch. The footsteps stopped just outside the door, and I could hear the low murmur of voices discussing something in tones too quiet to distinguish individual words, but the cadence and rhythm suggested men making plans rather than engaging in casual conversation. I moved quickly to extinguish the oil lamp, hoping to conceal our exact location within the cabin, but kept the fire burning because Eleanor needed its warmth to survive and because total darkness would leave us completely vulnerable to whatever threat was approaching. Through the gaps in the shuttered windows, I could see the dancing light of torches or lanterns, at least 3 or 4 based on the shifting patterns of illumination, and the shadows they cast on the snow moved with the purposeful coordination of men accustomed to working together. Eleanor pulled herself closer to the fire, her wedding dress rustling softly in the sudden silence, and I noticed that her earlier weakness seemed to be fading as adrenaline flooded her. This system with the primitive energy that sometimes allowed people to perform superhuman feats when faced with mortal danger. "They're not here to help us," she whispered, and something in her voice suggested she knew more about our situation than she'd initially revealed. That her presence at this godforsaken camp might not be as innocent as her story of a missing groom had implied. The murmuring outside stopped, replaced by a silence so complete it felt like the calm before an avalanche, and I found myself holding my breath as I strained to detect any sound that might give us advance warning of whatever was about to happen. One of the torches moved closer to our window, casting a grotesque shadow against the shutters, and in that distorted silhouette I thought I could make out the shape of a man's profile scarred, angular, and somehow familiar in a way that made my blood run cold with recognition. The stories Eleanor had mumbled in her delirium about the man with the scar suddenly took on terrifying new significance, and I realized we weren't dealing with random criminals or claim jumpers, but with someone who had specifically targeted Eleanor for reasons I didn't yet understand but suspected were far worse than simple robbery. The door exploded inward without warning, torn from its hinges by boots that had no patience for the niceties of knocking or requesting entry, and 3 men swept into the cabin like a pack of wolves scenting wounded prey. The leader was exactly as Eleanor's fevered descriptions had suggested, tall, lean, with a jagged scar running from his left temple to the corner of his mouth, giving his face a permanently twisted expression that spoke of violence and cruelty. As natural as breathing, his companions flanked him with the practiced ease of men accustomed to intimidation and worse, their hands resting casually on the handles of knives and pistols that had clearly seen recent use. "Well, well," the scarred man said, his voice carrying the educated accent of someone who'd received formal schooling before choosing a life outside civilized society. The famous Alaskan mailman and his precious cargo, delivered right to our doorstep by the storm itself. Eleanor shrank back against the wall, but I could see steel entering her spine as the initial shock gave way to the kind of desperate courage that emerged when people realized they had nothing left to lose. The scarred man's eyes never left Eleanor's face, studying her with the cold calculation of a predator evaluating its next meal, and when he smiled, I saw teeth that had been filed to points in a deliberate attempt to appear more menacing. "Did you really think you could disappear into the wilderness, my dear?" he continued, addressing Eleanor directly while his men moved to block our escape routes. "Did you honestly believe that changing your name and running to the frontier would free you from obligations that extend far beyond your personal desires?" His words suggested a history between them that Eleanor had concealed from me, and I realized with growing horror that her story of seeking a loving husband in Alaska might have been a desperate lie told by a woman fleeing from something far more dangerous than loneliness. The trap was now fully sprung, and whatever game these men had been playing with Eleanor was about to reach its conclusion, with me as an unwilling participant in a drama that might cost us both our lives. The scarred man's revelation hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel as Eleanor's carefully constructed facade finally crumbled, her shoulders sagging with the weight of secrets she could no longer carry alone. "My name isn't Eleanor," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the crackling fire, "and I never came here to marry anyone. I came here to disappear." The admission hit me like a physical blow because it meant everything I thought I understood about our situation was built on lies. But before I could process the full implications, she continued with the desperate honesty of someone who'd finally accepted that death might be preferable to whatever these men had planned. "I'm Catherine Blackwood from Boston, and these men work for my father, who would rather see me dead than allow me to testify about his business dealings with corrupt officials and murdered union organizers." The scarred man laughed, a sound like breaking glass that made my skin crawl, and I understood with crystalline clarity that we were trapped in the middle of a family drama that had escalated far beyond simple disagreement into the realm of assassination and conspiracy. Catherine, I couldn't think of her as Eleanor anymore, pulled herself upright with visible effort, meeting her pursuer's gaze with a defiance that spoke of aristocratic breeding and moral conviction stronger than her fear of death. The political implications of what she'd revealed crashed over me like an avalanche because everyone in Alaska had heard whispers about the Blackwood shipping empire and its rumored connections to violence and corruption, but hearing confirmation from the man's own daughter transformed gossip into horrifying reality. My mind raced through possible escape routes while Catherine continued her confession, knowing that our survival now depended on my ability to outthink men who'd had weeks or months to plan this confrontation. "Your father sends his regards," the scarred man said, pulling a folded paper from his coat with theatrical ceremony, along with instructions that are quite specific about how this matter should be resolved. He unfolded what appeared to be a telegram, squinting at it in the firelight before reading aloud. Retrieve the girl by any means necessary. Ensure she cannot testify. Make it look like an accident. Winter will provide perfect cover. The words were a death sentence delivered with bureaucratic efficiency, and I saw Catherine's face go pale as she realized that her own blood had signed her execution order without hesitation or remorse. The second man, shorter but more heavily built than his leader, shifted restlessly and said, "Boss, what about the mailman? He wasn't part of the original plan, but he's heard too much to walk away." The casual discussion of my murder filled me with rage rather than fear, and I found myself calculating distances and angles while forcing my face to remain expressionless and defeated. The third man stood by the door, his attention divided between watching for external threats and monitoring our movements. But I noticed that his grip on his weapon was relaxed, suggesting overconfidence that might be exploited if I could create the right distraction. Catherine caught my eye and gave an almost imperceptible nod, as if she'd read my thoughts and was prepared to help however she could, which meant that despite her deception about her identity, she still possessed the courage and quick thinking that had allowed her to survive this long while being hunted by professional killers. The scarred man was still savoring his moment of triumph, explaining in detail how they'd intercepted her correspondence with various frontier settlements and carefully guided her toward this isolated location where her disappearance could be blamed on the harsh realities of Alaskan winter. His monologue provided the opening I'd been waiting for, and I tensed my muscles in preparation for what would likely be a desperate gamble with death as the stakes. I launched myself at the oil lamp with every ounce of strength in my body, smashing it against the wooden floor and instantly plunging the cabin into near-total darkness, broken only by the flickering light from the fireplace. The sudden change from bright illumination to dancing shadows created the confusion I'd hoped for, and I heard curses and stumbling footsteps as the three men struggled to adjust to the new conditions while maintaining control of their weapons. Catherine rolled away from the fire toward the cabin's back wall, her white dress making her nearly invisible against the snow that had blown through gaps in the wooden boards, and I threw myself in the opposite direction to split their attention and make targeting either of us more difficult. The scarred man shouted orders to his companions, but the acoustics of the small cabin made it hard to determine exactly where voices were coming from, and I heard the solid thunk of someone running into furniture in the darkness. My hand found the iron poker beside the fireplace just as the heavy-set man's silhouette appeared against the orange glow, and I swung the improvised weapon with all the force I could muster, connecting with his skull in a blow that dropped him like a felled tree. The sound of his body hitting the floor was followed by Catherine's sharp intake of breath, but I had no time to check on her condition because the remaining two men were already adapting to the new circumstances with the professionalism of experienced killers. A muzzle flash lit up the cabin like lightning as one of them fired blindly in my direction, the bullet splintering wood inches from my head and filling the air with the acrid smell of gunpowder and fear. I rolled behind an overturned table just as another shot rang out, this one aimed at Catherine's last known position, and I prayed that her aristocratic upbringing had included some practical education in avoiding assassination attempts. The gunfire, what awakened my dogs outside, and their howling created an additional layer of chaos that might mask our movements but also advertised our location to anyone else who might be in the area. I could hear the scarred man moving carefully through the darkness, his breathing controlled and methodical as he searched for targets, while his remaining companion had apparently positioned himself near the door to prevent any escape attempts. Catherine's voice came from somewhere near the back wall, speaking in tones so low they barely registered above the crackling of the fire. "There's a window back here, but it's nailed shut." The information was useful but potentially deadly if our captors heard it, and I found myself holding my breath while straining to detect any indication that they'd overheard her whispered communication. The man by the door shifted his position, and I caught a glimpse of his profile outlined against the slightly brighter rectangle of the doorway. Realizing that he was actually watching for threats from outside rather than focusing entirely on us, this suggested that they were concerned about other parties who might interfere with their mission, which meant we weren't the only players in this deadly game, but it also presented an opportunity if I could position myself correctly. The scarred man was getting closer to my hiding place, his footsteps careful but audible on the wooden floor, and I knew that within seconds he would either discover my location or move close enough for me to launch another attack. The poker felt reassuringly solid in my grip, but I was acutely aware that I was fighting trained killers with nothing but improvised weapons and desperate courage. Hardly favorable odds for a man whose greatest combat experience involved wresting supplies away from stubborn pack animals. The next few moments would determine whether Catherine and I lived to see another dawn or joined the growing list of people who'd underestimated the reach and ruthlessness of the Blackwood family's power. A sound outside made everyone in the cabin freeze, the unmistakable crack of breaking ice followed by human shouts of alarm and what sounded like someone or something falling into water. The man by the door turned toward the noise, momentarily distracted from his guard duties, and I saw my chance to even the odds before our enemies could fully organize their response to this new development. I exploded from behind the table with the poker raised high, catching the distracted guard across the back of his skull before he could turn to face the threat, and his body crumpled without a sound except for the soft thud of dead weight hitting the floor. The scarred man spun toward me with his pistol raised, but Catherine chose that moment to smash through the nailed window, using what appeared to be a wooden stool, filling the cabin with frigid air and the sound of splintering wood that masked my approach until I was close enough to strike. My poker connected with his gun hand just as he pulled the trigger, sending the shot wild while numbing his fingers enough to make him drop the weapon. But he recovered faster than I'd expected, and caught me with a backhand blow that sent me staggering toward the fire. Catherine had disappeared through the broken window, and I could hear her calling to my dogs in a voice that suggested she understood how to handle animals, which meant our escape route was being prepared even as I fought for my life against a man who'd clearly killed with his bare hands before. The scarred man drew a knife from his boot with his uninjured hand, advancing on me with the patient confidence of someone who'd ended many lives and expected this one to be no different. Outside, the sounds of distress were growing louder, suggesting that whatever had caused the initial commotion was escalating into a larger crisis. But I had no attention to spare for external events while facing down a blade that gleamed with murderous intent in the firelight. The cabin had become an arena where decades of postal service and wilderness survival would be tested against professional violence, and I suspected that only one of us would walk away from this confrontation alive. The knife came at me in a silver arc that would have opened my throat if I hadn't thrown myself backward into the blazing fireplace, accepting the searing pain of flames against my coat rather than the finality of cold steel across my neck. The scarred man followed through with his lunge, overbalancing when his blade met only air, and I rolled away from the fire with my clothing smoldering, grabbing a burning log that I swung at his head with desperation born from 23 years of refusing to let Alaska claim my life. The makeshift weapon connected with his temple in a shower of sparks and charred wood, sending him sprawling across the cabin floor where he lay motionless except for the slow rise and fall of his chest. Outside, Catherine's voice rose above the howling wind as she called my name with increasing urgency, and through the broken window I could see the orange glow of what appeared to be a much larger fire than the one I'd just escaped. The sounds of distress I'd heard earlier had evolved into full-scale panic, with multiple voices shouting warnings about ice breaking and structures collapsing, suggesting that whatever crisis had begun during our fight was now threatening the entire mining camp. I staggered to my feet, my back burning from contact with the flames but my limbs still functional, and grabbed the scarred man's fallen pistol before stumbling toward the window where Catherine waited in the swirling snow. As I climbed through the jagged opening, leaving behind the cabin that had nearly become our tomb, I carried with me not just the physical wounds of our confrontation but the knowledge that Catherine Blackwood's secrets ran deeper than family betrayal and corporate corruption. The night was far from over, and the truth about what had really brought her to this godforsaken corner of Alaska was still buried beneath layers of deception that would soon demand their own terrible price. Catherine stood beside my sled with Thor's reins in her hands, her aristocratic composure replaced by the grim determination of someone who'd accepted that survival required embracing violence and moral compromise. "The main camp building is on fire," she said, pointing toward the largest structure in the settlement where flames were already licking through the roof despite the falling snow. "And I think there are people trapped inside." Her words carried implications that made my blood run colder than the Arctic air because it meant we weren't alone at Coldwater Creek, that other players in this deadly game had been present all along, hidden and waiting for reasons I was only beginning to understand. The fire cast dancing shadows across the snow, revealing details of the camp that had been invisible in the storm-fresh tire tracks leading to and from various buildings. Supply caches that suggested recent habitation, even what appeared to be radio equipment hastily abandoned near one of the smaller cabins. Catherine's eyes met mine with an intensity that spoke of shared secrets finally ready to be revealed. And when she spoke again, her voice carried the weight of confession that could no longer be delayed by circumstances or fear. "I lied about why I came here," she said, her breath forming clouds of vapor that dissipated quickly in the frigid air. "I'm not just running from my father's assassins. I'm here because Thomas Whitmore contacted me months ago with evidence that could destroy the Blackwood Empire and everyone connected to it." The revelation hit me like a physical blow because it meant that the missing miner wasn't just an innocent victim of circumstances but a potential ally who'd risked everything to expose corruption that reached from Boston's financial district to Alaska's remotest wilderness. As we stood there in the falling snow with flames rising behind us and unknown dangers lurking in the darkness ahead, I realized that Catherine's arrival at this desolate camp had never been about finding love or starting a new life, but about retrieving information that powerful men would kill to suppress the implications of Catherine's admission. cascaded through my mind like an avalanche as I helped her onto the sled, my hands shaking not from cold but from the realization that I'd stumbled into a conspiracy that involved murdered union organizers, corrupted officials, and evidence valuable enough to justify hunting a woman across an entire continent. Whitmore found documents, Catherine continued as we prepared to flee the burning camp. Shipping manifests that prove my father's company has been smuggling weapons to company militias, records of payments to judges and politicians, even photographs of meetings between Blackwood executives and known assassins. Her words painted a picture of corruption so vast and systematic that my simple frontier existence seemed laughably naive by comparison. But they also explained why professional killers had been willing to brave Alaskan winter to silence her permanently. The fire was spreading to adjacent buildings despite the snow, creating an orange glow that would be visible for miles and likely attract attention from anyone else operating in the area, which meant our window for escape was rapidly closing. I called to my dogs and felt them respond with the eager energy of animals sensing their master's urgency. But as we began to move away from the camp, Catherine grabbed my arm with surprising strength. "We can't leave yet," she said, her voice carrying an authority that reminded me of her aristocratic background. "Thomas hid the documents somewhere in the camp, and without them, every death and sacrifice will have been meaningless." Her insistence on staying near the burning buildings seemed like madness, but I understood that for someone who'd given up everything to expose the truth, abandoning the evidence would be a betrayal worse than death. The wind was picking up again, fanning the flames higher while also carrying the sound of approaching engines through the storm. And I realized that other parties were converging on Coldwater Creek with timing that suggested careful coordination rather than coincidence. We had perhaps minutes to find Whitmore's hidden cache before being trapped between the fire and whatever new threats were racing toward us through the frozen wilderness. Catherine directed me toward a small cabin on the camp's periphery, claiming that Whitmore's letters had contained coded references to a place where miners keep their most precious treasures, which she interpreted as a hidden safe or storage area away from the main operations. The building she indicated showed no signs of fire damage but was partially collapsed under the weight of accumulated snow, requiring us to dig through drifts that had piled against what remained of the entrance. As we worked frantically to clear a path, the sound of approaching vehicles grew louder, and I could distinguish at least 2 engines, possibly more, suggesting that whoever was coming had resources and organization that dwarfed anything Catherine and I could muster. Inside the ruined cabin, our search revealed overturned furniture, scattered papers, and clear evidence of a violent struggle, but no obvious hiding place for documents important enough to justify multiple murders. Catherine moved with purpose through the debris, running her hands along walls and floorboards as if following instructions from memory. And when she pressed against a seemingly solid section of the back wall, a hidden panel swung open to reveal a metal strongbox wrapped in oiled cloth. The box was heavy enough to require both of us to lift it, and when Catherine produced a key that matched the one I'd found among the stolen letters, we discovered contents that justified every risk we'd taken: photographs, documents, ledgers, and correspondence that painted a comprehensive picture of corruption. Reaching from Boston's highest social circles to Alaska's most remote mining operations, the evidence was damning enough to topple governments and destroy fortunes. But as we struggled to carry our treasure toward the sled, the approaching engine suddenly went silent, replaced by the ominous sound of boots crunching through snow and voices coordinating in military-style whispers. Our discovery had come too late, and the new arrivals were already positioning themselves to prevent our escape with evidence that could reshape the balance of power across 2 continents. The final confrontation began not with dramatic speeches or threats, but with the sudden appearance of uniformed men emerging from the storm like ghosts materialized from the frozen air itself. These weren't hired killers or corporate thugs, but federal marshals with badges and legal authority, their presence transforming our desperate flight into something approaching an official arrest rather than simple murder. "Miss Blackwood," their leader called out, his voice carrying across the wind with practiced authority. "You're under federal protection now, and we have warrants for the arrest of everyone involved in this conspiracy." Catherine's response surprised me with its mixture of relief and continued wariness, as if she'd been expecting this intervention but wasn't entirely certain of these men's ultimate loyalties. The marshals had apparently been tracking the same evidence we'd just recovered, following a trail of corruption that had led them from Boston courtrooms to Alaskan wilderness, and their arrival represented either salvation or simply a different form of captivity for someone who'd learned to trust no one in positions of power. As they secured the strongbox and began documenting the scene, I found myself wondering whether Thomas Whitmore was alive somewhere, perhaps in federal custody, or whether he'd paid the ultimate price for his courage in exposing truths that powerful men preferred to keep buried. The fire continued to burn behind us, consuming whatever secrets the main camp had contained, while federal investigators gathered evidence that would eventually topple the Blackwood Empire and expose corruption that reached into the highest levels of American business and government. Catherine and I had survived the frozen wilderness and professional assassins, but the true test of our ordeal would come in courtrooms and congressional hearings where the documents we'd retrieved would either bring justice or simply transfer power from one set of corrupt hands to another. As dawn finally broke over the Alaskan wilderness, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of pink and gold, I realized that my simple life as a frontier mailman was forever changed, transformed by a single delivery that had revealed how far men would go to protect their secrets, and how much courage was required to expose the truth in a world where power and corruption walked hand in hand. Through the corridors of civilization,